Today we tried to simplify the agenda a bit. We really got bogged down on goals and I don't know if we really got past goals over the last several meetings. What we've decided we'd like to do, Steele and I as chairs, is try to limit today to discussion of the future land use classification categories that's in the packet in front of you, and then the draft housing study that was also recently sent out. Those are two things I don't think we have had an opportunity to look at all. As far as the other items, I know there are some follow-up that needs to be done on the goals and then also on the draft comprehensive plan. It's a lot of pages. I wanted to give everyone a chance to actually digest it. So what we're going to do is have everyone read through it, and then specifically on the goals portion, if you have any comments about the revised goals, I'd like those in writing submitted to the group, and then we can see the sections that have the most comments that we can cover those first, so we make sure we're hitting the higher priorities. And then also on the comprehensive plan, I just want everybody to have a chance to look through that before we really dive into it in the meeting. I know it says in here also discuss project updates. Do we have any updates?
I was just going to do a recap of the last few meetings. On January 26th, we met and did another review of those draft guiding principles, and then the consultant revised those. I'm actually working on getting a red line. Ken asked for a red line version to see the changes that they made from the last draft, so it's more easy, it's more apparent. So I'm going to get that and get it to you guys by late Friday or early Monday. Also, the Housing and Economic Development Survey ended yesterday. I'm waiting to get the results from that from our consultant to see if we hit our numbers, do we need to extend it. And so we'll be sharing that with the group. And then on like Ken said, on February 13th, we sent you several different things: the revised guiding principles, draft of the comp plan, and then draft of the future land use classifications, which are in the comp plan, but we pulled them out separately so you guys could kind of review those as a separate item. And also the housing study that is being revised. We had that workshop with City Council and P&Z, and they wanted more local data incorporated into it. So we've been working with Ed and some of our other local property managers to get that data incorporated, so it's a more better reflection of our current conditions in Nacogdoches. And so that's all that I had, Ken. Okay. And then we'll talk about upcoming meetings at the end.
Okay.
It's gonna be tough with that, man.
Yeah, and we don't have a map yet on overlaying these future land use designations. Is that correct?
Correct. The consultant wanted to get the group's temperature on the actual classifications and the wording in that first.
Okay.
Before they applied it to the map.
Okay. Yeah, because this is a little different. If anybody's looked at it's probably been a while. It's been about a year, so I guess, since we looked at the old comp plan future land use map. It's a little different, I think, on how it marks out future land use. And the idea there is looking at, we have a lot of land inside the city limits or in the extraterritorial jurisdiction of the city that was undeveloped when the city developed its first zoning back in the 70s, I guess. A lot of that was just overlaid as agricultural, even though probably doesn't make sense for some of it to be agricultural at this point. So, when you look at the comprehensive plan that we have currently, there's plans for that land. Most of it is not planned to remain agricultural. It's either going to be residential, business, or some other commercial use. industrial possibly. So the idea here is looking through this, the different categories of residential, commercial, industrial. I want to make sure that we think that the categories here are sufficient, that we understand the different types of housing units that might be indicated by each or included in each category, and any other questions or comments we might have on the categories. As you said, it's going to overlay on a map, and so you know, question might be, do we need to be more, for example, looking at residential future use, do we need to be more, do we need to, I know we have subcategories of low to medium density and medium to high density. Is that sufficient? Or do we need to be more granular, or kind of think about things in a little bit more detailed way when we're looking at the future use map? And since I haven't heard from DTJ on that, are they, as far as those future uses go, is there a specific cutoff that you know about on what medium density is or low density? Are they using numbers?
Yeah, so the idea is that low to medium density are your traditional, go all the way from your traditional like half-acre single-family lots to something like a patio home, like a smaller lot, single-family, maybe even townhome. And then your medium to high density is your more dense type development. You know, your larger multifamily, maybe even a really dense single-family. So the idea is low to medium is your traditional large lot single-family. Different types of single family, including detached and attached, and then, like I said, the medium to high is your multifamily, your triplexes, your fourplexes. But the reason I think that they did it this way is because our current future land use map really reads like the zoning map. It's got the same titles, it's got the same colors, and so it looks like our zoning map. And the future land use plan really is meant to be more broad in nature. And provides some flexibility to evaluate cases based on existing conditions and changing demographics and things like that. And so I think this is an attempt to make it more broad so that it doesn't read like a zoning map, because it really isn't. I hope that makes sense. And so based on your direction, we can ask or direct the consultant to provide some more preciseness and some more detail in these, so that way it's more instructive and there's not as much room for interpretation. So I think that this is a starting point, and then based on your feedback, it'll most definitely change.
Are there any comments specifically, I guess, looking at the existing, we'll start with the residential existing. Any comments from anyone on those categories? You know, those are existing conditions, so I'm assuming they're just going to be overlaying like mixed residential that would go over, like you said, a fourplex, or it could go over one of the bigger apartment complexes.
Yeah, so the existing is meant to kind of memorialize what's on the ground right now and recognize our existing neighborhoods as things that we want to protect and preserve. And then the future is more for those undeveloped areas that have more opportunity for infill and growth and so on and so forth. So the idea is we want to recognize what's there today, and then also identify those kind of future growth residential areas.
One of the things that came to my mind was in looking at the housing study that you sent out, you had mentioned that I think 41% of the existing residential was built between 1970 and 1989. Is that like something that we would consider here, age?
Yes, yeah, so like you said, oldest town in Texas, there's a lot of development that was built prior to our current ordinances. And so this could identify those areas as well. So think of Colonial Hills, think of those neighborhoods on Sunset Avenue and some of those older, more established neighborhoods, that's what you would see on here.
So age is gonna be included? Okay.
Yes.
The existing map has it divided into single family and multifamily.
Mhm.
And this one divides it into existing and future residential.
Mhm.
Is there any way we could get your map put up? It would help the conversation.
It's a car map.
I agree.
Yeah. Thank you, Larry.
Do we have an Elmo in here?
A what?
An Elmo?
Elmo?
A document came?
Oh, no.
An overhead projector.
I wasn't
No.
talking about the.
I can pull it up online. Yeah, I'll pull it up online.
You have a slide.
It's online, yeah.
Then now you can take a picture of it and put it.
We can get it online, yeah.
Well, yeah, I think he wants it for discussion, so you can look at it now.
I said somebody get this picture and put it up there, but she pulled it up online. Everybody didn't bring their map with them?
We can have it in here.
Ken, while they're doing that,
Y'all are like my students.
there are two
I guess we're failing.
overreaching issues that we need to keep in mind when we talk about future land use and all that sort of thing. One of them is that, in the previous comprehensive plan, and I think the intention now, is that agriculture zoning within the city limits is a placeholder.
That's right.
And so we need to make that clear in this, that future land use could be determined at a different time, but agriculture zoning is not a zoning that says, oh, nothing can be built here. It's just a placeholder.
Right. It's a default for,
Correct, we don't know yet.
Yeah.
The other option, other thing too, that I'm a little bit concerned about, is there's been some discussion that any property that is in the floodplain can never be developed. In floodway, yes, I agree with that, but floodplain, by our statutes that we have with the city now, if you fill that a foot above floodplain, then it's buildable. So I'd love a statement in there also that says, you know, floodplain land is not always gonna be, and it's a case-by-case basis. And, just case in point, University Drive would be empty right now if we followed that way. Because tons of that property was under the floodplain, we built it up, and now it's developed. And so one of our growth corridors right now, North University Drive to the loop, would not exist if we didn't follow that. And I'm not talking about something that's next to a creek, it just happens to be lower. Because, you know, if you use North University Drive, if you're going north all the way to the loop, the left-hand side is floodplain and flood abatement.
right.
On the
Where
right-hand
the
side.
trail is.
Right,
Yeah.
right. On the right-hand side, not anywhere near water, but it's still in the floodplain.
Mhm.
And the thing that we deal with, and I don't wanna get off into the weeds too much, but I think Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're dealing with a 1984 map from FEMA. And it costs millions of dollars to update that map. And there are remedies that you can do with FEMA, but at the same time, we have to go by something that's probably not accurate now, but it's still the rule.
Mhm.
So anyway, and it concerns me
This
that
is my problem.
we'll say all floodplain land can never be developed, and agricultural land is what we're gonna give it if we don't want it to be developed.
And I don't think most people know how much. It wasn't until I was looking at park locations that our map to even see a huge portion of Nacogdoches is floodplain land. Like,
Mhm.
if you start taking that land out,
Right.
that's pretty much everywhere that's not already got something on it.
Right.
So,
Yeah, creek protection to me is a totally different animal
Right.
than flood zone. You know, it may or may not be having to do with creek, it's just
Yeah.
elevation.
What, did you say that on the future land use, it identifies agriculture?
Well, the Ken was saying is correct, that we have large portions of our property in the city limits that's zoned to agriculture because they didn't know what it was gonna be, single family, R4.
Is that in
commercial.
zoning though? Is that in
It is a
zoning?
zone, yes,
It's a zoning?
agriculture
Yeah,
is a
because
zone.
I don't see any agricultural designation on this overlay.
No, it's an
And
actual
there's not
zoning.
on here either.
Yeah.
I think it's the rural development, if you overlaid the two, it would be
Yeah.
pretty close.
Yeah,
The
our,
green.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. So the future land use, there is a rural development classification. And a lot of properties that you see that are zoned ag are also rural. But agriculture zoning is kind of like a default zoning. When you get annexed to the city, you're automatically zoned agriculture until a more appropriate zoning category can be identified. So it is kind of like a placeholder until there's interest in the property to change it to something else.
Lines go
Yeah.
through
I just think that needs to be clear within the plan.
Okay.
trees there.
Hey, Steve. Is it the 100-year floodplain that we're concerned about? Is that the one that
Yes.
is gonna impact?
Our regulations are based around the 100-year flood.
Okay. So this is the existing, the 2003 version on the screen.
Yes.
And it's broken into rural, single-family, multifamily, then you get commercial, public, industrial,
Yeah, it's just, you go, thank you.
parks. And then mixed-use citricity.
Other way. Thank you. More. Yeah.
Fill up the screen.
Yeah.
You know.
How's that? Is that good?
As far as development goes. Steve, could you explain the difference between the floodway and the floodplain for us?
Sure. It's a lot easier with graphics, but basically the floodplain itself is the entire area that FEMA models that would flood in a particular event, in this case, a 100-year storm, which is a theoretical storm. The floodway is a theoretical, computer-generated theoretical line. Now, it is generally along the creek, and what you perceive when you look at it is that fast-moving water area, but that's not the criteria. It's actually an area that's defined by if we begin to fill the flood fringes, put fill in, put fill in, put fill in, well, the water begins to rise because it has less room to flow. And when that water has risen 1 foot on this model, then that's where the floodway line is drawn. So how far can you fill in the entire floodplain fringes and not impact the water surface more than 1 foot? And so that is a theoretical definition of floodway. So the floodways are significantly more protected under FEMA because obviously we don't want to cause flooding more than a foot. And by the way, the model isn't accurate more than a foot, and that's kind of where that comes from. And so we don't want to have upstream or downstream flooding because we allow floodplain development. So they control how we do that so that we as local floodplain administrators don't let development go crazy and cause flood impacts. Because you can't do that in your head, it's a big model. So that's our line. So the floodway line is basically a no-build area, generally speaking.
Okay. And you say fill, you're talking about actual landfill?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, actually earth. So the process you see in a lot, it's in prior to, it was 1980, it was our flood maps, but 1980. Prior to 1980, we didn't have maps. And so we have developments here, apartments, everybody knows, floods, things, those were just built. They were just built. And so now they are, apartments that have been built since then near the creek have been filled. They go to FEMA and get a revision to the map based on fill, which removes it from the floodplain, and then they build the project. So, albeit a technicality when I say it that way, but you say these were built in the floodplain, they were built in what used to be the floodplain and it has now been removed.
Okay.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Any other questions?
So, any comments on as far as the new designations going from, and I guess I'm having trouble. Do you know if Elena, if there's going to be any variation in the yellow, or is everything just going to be either yellow or orange?
So whenever I talk to the consultant, I ask, hey, how would this look? And there's one or two ways we could do it. We could either actually have them like break out those as separate independent land use categories. So have suburban residential, mixed use residential, and conservation, and just break them out as the actual colors on the map. And then have some sort of line type or symbol that delineated those as existing versus future. Because I think just having those two categories and having to look into the text to look at subcategories can be cumbersome and difficult. And so I would actually recommend breaking those out and having them independent, and then having some sort of other notation to identify those as existing or future.
Yeah, because I guess, well, because the historic district is not, it's not all residential, right? So.
Yeah, and the historic district will be shown on a different map.
Yeah.
So there will be, the idea is there's the future land use map, and then there's a supplemental map that'll have historic overlay, those neighborhood transition areas, gateways, like key entries into the community or physical infrastructures of interest, and then the watersheds, so like your floodplain area. Because we don't want the map to be too busy to where there's so much on there you can't, discern what's what.
Is there any discussion about future, like, conservation districts?
Yeah, so under residential existing, there's suburban residential, mixed residential, and conservation. That's those historic districts. But it could be expanded to include just historical neighborhoods that aren't necessarily located in an official historic district, but they're historical in character or nature, and so maybe those areas need more protections than other areas of town.
Do we lose anything by not having the designation of single and multifamily residential on the map? Or do we lose anything significant?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think our current single-family definition does include duplex, and then multifamily is essentially anything above duplex. But again, it reads just like a zoning map, and so it doesn't provide a lot of flexibility. And so there's different types of housing types. There's different types of development that may have the same density as a single family but look different, right? Have different housing types mixed into the same neighborhood. And so the idea, based on my feedback from the consultant, is that these categories provide a little bit more flexibility in the way that we look at different types of zoning, because the idea is that there's probably going to be new zoning districts that come out of this as well. And so we just want to make sure that the future land use map isn't the zoning map, and there's no, because when you do those too similar, it creates confusion. But do we lose anything? I don't think so. I'd be interested to hear what the group thinks.
As somebody who's had to look at this before for zoning changes, I think that, as far as keeping residential kind of in one group is probably helpful, because I think most of the time the issue you're dealing with is a change between it's somebody wanting to put a business or industrial or some other special use permit type use that would not be typically in a residential setting, what's already zoned residential, or in a agricultural or rural development property that is under, and that's part of the problem with the existing map, is it leaves a lot of that green, so it doesn't really help you. But sometimes on there it's marked as being residential in the future. And so the idea with this map, I think, is to guide, well, if we're gonna allow a special use or a use against what the current zoning is, what is our future desire for this area of the city? Is it supposed to be residential, or is it supposed to be some other use? I think that's the most important question you probably ask. And then when it comes down to density and other questions, I think that's really outside of, that's a zoning issue and not a future land use issue. Because that is gonna have to get spelled out on a zoning map.
Yeah.
That's my thought.
And I think Ken just raised a good point. What's this map of use requirements?
Yeah, I would be, it seemed like we were asking, what would be the implications, would it create more of this, type of housing? What would be the impact?
For example, right now, if you come in with a zoning change and it's different than what the use is supposed to be under the current map, you have to justify why you're changing it. And so it should be a broad category to start out, I think, because there's all kinds of determinations, I think, that go into whether or not a property can be used for certain, like, multifamily versus single-family residential, and that's access and, whether the services can support it. And a lot of that's zoning driven, and it's not necessarily, thank you.
He's passing out the
Thank
map.
you.
What are we doing?
And
Thank you.
Ken,
Mhm.
like, when the zoning commission, do they look at this map? Or do they look at the zoning map?
Both. So this map, under the current zoning code, which again might change in the process, but under the current regulations, if you come in and you want to change your use, we look at this to say, is it compatible with what we said we want to put in that area? So if you want to put
I think it's
a factory in,
the same.
and we have it marked as a future land use of residential, you're gonna have to have a really good reason why you wanna put a factory there, for example. So it's an extreme example, but, that is when we look at this map. The zoning map comes into play when you're dealing with, more specific situations on changing or zoning or allowing for special uses of zoning.
So if one lives in this rural development section like I do, although I'm only 7/10 of a mile from SFA campus, how do they decide that that's a rural development area?
Well, that would, if you came in, you wanted to change the use of your property, then we would look at this map right now, because it's the current one, and say whether or not the use you're proposing is compatible with rural development. Now, the problem is, if you look at up the, I don't know if I have the top half of it.
Because all the way from most of Star, east of
Yep.
of the university, on the right-hand side as you head east, is rural development.
Yeah,
I guess that would be the goal, that would be our new map, theoretically, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think a new map would probably need to, does that make sense for that to be rural development?
In a way,
right?
but most of that side also, the lower part of it is, if you notice when you drive up that road, on the right-hand side as you head east, you don't see many houses because that is floodplain area. And most of the houses are built,
On the hill, yeah.
800 or 900 feet off of the road because the hill goes, goes up. So the houses are mostly built on the left as you head east where the land is higher.
Yeah, and I think that's a good question, because I mean, there's a lot of green space over there right now. But a more problematic area, in my opinion, would be the loop on the west side of town, which is gonna be interstate eventually. A lot of that is still listed as rural development. And when somebody would come in for a zone change and, knowing that clearly that's probably should be commercial property going forward, or at least some portion of it, right now it's kind of, when you look at that, it's not providing any guidance to a zoning commission or to city council as to what do we want to do with this in the future. So I think that's probably a bigger issue.
And Ken, if I may, the rural designation on a lot of these properties, when you look at the definition, it calls it out as sparsely populated areas that may have limited access to infrastructure, or areas that are transitioning to more urban type of development. And so at the time, a lot of these were designated that because they didn't have a lot of infrastructure in place. But as properties develop, that infrastructure gets extended, and so those aren't really, those properties don't have the same kind of character or developable potential that they
Right.
used to.
You talk about like city, access to city services?
Yeah,
Okay.
water, sewer, streets, like, especially some of these larger tracts that are just wooded, or, they may have a street, but there's not adequate water or sewer. And so the idea is, as the city develops, those would transition to other types of uses, as the city grows.
Okay. Yeah, so I think to answer, you asked a few minutes ago, Larry, but I think the purpose of this map is really to say, okay, if you come in and you want to do something that's outside of our zoning code, as it's currently laid out, does that fit with the vision, the adopted vision on the behalf of council for that part of the city going forward? And doesn't mean that we don't go against it currently because it's out of date and because sometimes what you expected to happen in that area hasn't happened.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea is to at least go forward and say, well, we want this to be residential, or we want to keep our industrial uses here.
Yeah.
I think that's the intent.
Yeah, a great example is, in the comp plan, there's actually a chapter under the future land use section that states that because multifamily is market-driven and it's hard to depict on a plan, that you can have a multifamily request that can still be favorable even if it's not depicted because it is so market-driven. And so there's stuff in there that explains that the map isn't the end-all be-all, and that we look at all sections of the comp plan whenever we're reviewing these types of zoning requests, including the environmental section and the historic section, and so it's a comprehensive review. The future land use is an important part of that, but it's not the only thing that's looked at. Mabel?
I have a question in reference to the historic overlay district, and it says that the Shawnee residential area is pending historic district. I was wondering, would that historic district limit the mixed, for other smaller companies and funeral parlors,
Yeah.
small recreational areas, etc. Would that limit any growth in that area? Because it was
Yeah.
formerly
Mhm.
a plethora
Yeah.
of other small businesses that were needed to support that community.
Mhm.
Now, will this designation limit that growth?
No, ma'am. So the Shawnee area, there has been some interest from property owners in that area to look at certain areas for historic designation, but we probably shouldn't include that in this document because it is pending, it's not actual. But historic overlay doesn't actually change the zoning or what's allowed under the underlying zoning district. It just has an additional layer of approval for external improvements to buildings. So it doesn't change what you can do with the property as far as land use. It just requires an additional review by the Historic Landmark and Preservation Committee when you're making structural changes or changes that affect the aesthetics of existing buildings. Does that make sense? Yeah, so if you have a single-family zoning district and there's a historic overlay on top of that, it's still zoned single-family. The overlay doesn't affect the actual zoning. So you could still use it for what it was originally intended for. You're welcome.
So who does the math?
I'm sorry?
Who does the math?
Well, the future land use plan the future land use plan map will be updated with this process and adopted. So you'll have an updated map that gets approved as part of the this comprehensive plan document. So that'll be drafted or created by the consultant, but based on your feedback. So once we get an actual new draft of the map, it'll come to this group and you'll vet that and make your comments, and then it'll get modified based on the feedback.
Didn't you bring up landfill? That's it, someone. How much did you say this was?
I don't know, Steve talked about it, and he said there's
What are we waiting on?
quite a bit of capacity there.
Okay.
And I think there's even a project to receive more.
That's right, that's right.
So,
That was just something.
the,
4 years in the future.
Yeah, that's right.
looks like the major change then is gonna be to the, removing the multi and single family distinction. Is what I'm seeing.
Yeah, and so the idea is that multifamily would be included in that mixed residential category.
Right. But that's gonna be the same color on the future land use map, right? It'll
Mhm.
just be,
But if the group thinks that these subcategories should be kind of taken out and created into separate colors, so that way it's more evident on the plan, then that's something that we can direct the consultant to do. And we can also ask for more clarification on what the different categories mean as far as density types and things like that, if the group thinks they're too broad.
yeah, cause right now, and I did like how they're alluding to there being a separate overlay map, which would have, transition areas. Cause that was one of the things I think we discussed early on in the process where, you know, right now we don't really have that. You might go residential and then industrial right across the street, or maybe the next lot over. And I think that would be very helpful to see in practice. I think that's gonna require a lot of review though, as far as how would that actually affect, you know, if we're saying, well, we wanna prioritize a certain area for residential use and then allow commercial use adjacent, well, what kind of a transition zone are we talking about?
Yeah.
And, you know, I've seen what they do in some other cities, in practice. I don't even know if that's what their maps look like though. So I'm curious to see what the map, how the map would lay that out.
Yeah, so the idea is you have the future land use with the colors, and then the second lap, you know, it would identify those neighborhood transition areas, and essentially provide some guidance to areas that maybe need some additional design standards to make development in that area more compatible with existing residential or other types of development. So that could be a tool to help the city adopt additional development regulations specific to those areas. So the map would identify the areas that it applies to, and then potentially we could use that to create additional design standards to improve the compatibility of different land uses.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. I think that could be really important though, because we just don't have anything like that right now.
Yeah, so, yes, correct. So right now we have historic districts, and then they just stop abruptly. And then right next to it, you have non-historic districts. But there's nothing that in our code that requires any kind of compatible design or sensitive design standards to make it blend in with what's there today. So it can create some stark differences in design. This also would apply to some established single-family neighborhoods, maybe even if they aren't, you know, historic. So once we get the map, you guys will have a big role in identifying where those areas are.
I have a question, please.
Yeah, of course.
Over this last year, we've done a lot of talking about multifamily residential areas, but when you look at this, there's not much that is dedicated to any of that for future development. I mean, I'm hopeful that I always get to live in a single family residence, but everybody can't afford that, and if, you know, we have a lot more of this single family residential area than we do, which is the other, not that it has to be equal exactly,
Mhm.
but that there probably ought to be more.
Yeah. Well, in our current future land use map, when you look at the orange on the map, it's really identifying existing multifamily.
Yeah.
And so there's not a lot of undeveloped areas on the map that are designated for future multifamily development.
I don't have to have a real answer, but I think you ought to think about it.
Looking at their new categories, low-density housing is in the suburban residential in both of those categories of existing and future. So that would mean that all of the low-density housing is gonna be in suburban areas.
Mhm.
That's
Yes.
gonna be what we planned for.
Well, this is just, we're just looking at the categories right now.
Right. And that's what I'm saying, that is the categories.
Yes.
That's their categories.
Yeah.
Are you saying suburban like outside town, like what we traditionally think of as like?
I assume that's what
It probably
they
does
mean.
need to be reworded. That word to me means,
I assume
outside of town a little
outside
bit.
of the city limits.
I don't think that's
That's what
probably.
comes to my mind as well.
Yeah, I mean, if they're saying it's low and medium density, that would be, like Elena was saying, pretty much most of our normal single-family neighborhoods, but that word does
Yeah,
sort of make me think that it's pushing it outside of.
I think that would be like Colonial Hills or, you know.
Well, not according to them.
So suburban, the word suburban is typically associated with, residential, single-family development, or just kind of, lower density development. You think of your larger lot, single family, you think of your commercial that's kind of spread out. And so basically not dense is the idea. So you could consider Colonial Hills suburban in nature because it's not dense. It's large lots, single family, there's open space. That's kind of the idea. But if the group thinks that there should be more clarification as to what these different categories mean, I think that's a good comment to give back.
Definitely. And I think if you are gonna divide single and multifamily on the map, then you probably need to include some more space for multifamily, because pretty much everything on here is already developed, it seems, except for maybe a few areas. Looks like they just put orange over the existing multifamily zoning. But, so it doesn't really leave you much, with everything being rural development, it doesn't really leave you much options if you're looking to develop anything. We have any comments from the visitors in the room on the map as far as future land use? No?
I think the word suburban is a bit misleading too. It's more for bigger cities that have suburbs, outside suburbs, and that's more, I can see the description being accurate, but,
I think I would like to know what they mean, what their definition of suburban is. Maybe my definition and their definition are two different things.
Yeah, that's a good comment, if we could get some more detail on that.
Okay.
I do have a question. Is this plan available to review? I mean, I see some people have something with draft written on it. I don't know if anybody, if that's available to, for citizens to look at.
Yeah, so we provided the drafts to the committee so they can vet them first, because more than likely, even based on the comments today, they're going to be revised. And so we want to make sure that the committee's vetted these and they've gone through that process before we release them to the public for consumption, because we want whatever we release to the public to be blessed by the board. And so that's the idea. So we haven't published these on the website yet, but we will as soon as we get more consensus and realize that these are gonna be, if not finished, almost finished.
So when will it be available to read?
Well, it depends on how long it takes the committee to get through the documents.
Okay.
And I did have one other comment with that, I don't know if y'all want to hear it. I know when Mabel was talking about the neighborhood up there on Shawnee Street, she was kind of talking about mixed use, like houses and then a little shop on the corner, and then more houses, kind of a neighborhood with some little shops on in there. People might have a shop doing something, making something, or, and I think the answer was answering her main question, but it didn't really address, is that something that's like a future use category, or something that will be possible in the future? Or is that something that we want to, have or allow, or just forbid, that you have a little, store on the corner of a neighborhood? That was my thought when Mabel asked that, and I didn't really feel like that kind of got.
And will the mixed use designation be limited by the historic overlay? That was really my
Oh, yeah,
concern.
and then she answered that question very well, it won't be.
It will not be limited.
No, but you might have, a historic overlay would severely limit what you could do with individual buildings that are existing.
Right. You might not be able to paint the brick on your old building.
Or the cost
That's right.
to renovate one might be very high. So, there are some downsides to it, for the preservation aspect. But
And was I understanding you right, Elena, with that if we had this conservation category, that would be separate and distinct from an actual like historic designation? Because I was thinking about like that area in Shawnee after we learned that the actual, property owners have to be the one to apply for historic designation.
Yeah.
And I can think of many reasons why people might not want to do that, even if I think it might be a better idea. I can see how that could be a really challenge for people.
Yeah.
And so is that a way that maybe if we're saying on the land use that it's in a conservation area, then we can at least protect those areas without them necessarily having to have applied for official historic designation? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yes, because we do have a lot of
Within
properties and
the-
neighborhoods in town that are historic in nature, but they're not on the National Register. And so they wouldn't qualify for necessarily our official historic overlay, but maybe those areas should still be preserved and provided some more protections because of their historical character.
And there might be less restrictions than like a historic overlay side, but still some protection.
Yeah.
So I could see a real benefit of having areas for that.
May I ask who applied for the historic overlay?
So, I'm sorry? Yeah,
So
Rob.
that is actually mislabeled. Nobody has actually applied. There was consideration of should this area be under historic overlay, and DTJ misheard that, and so that's why they labeled it pending. There is not a pending or an application that's been submitted.
Because I know that there is some rumblings of doing some new things in that area, which would require securing some of the existing property and rebuild it. And would that be limited by that designation?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think what Brian's trying to say is we just had a conversation with DTJ, let them know, hey, there's interest in this area being designated as historic, and so it shouldn't have been included in this document. But the idea is that the historic overlay that you see here with the 2 asterisks, that's just gonna locate what's already designated, right? So it's just gonna reflect our current historical overlay map. And then the conservation under residential existing, that's meant for areas that could be historic districts, or they could just be areas that have historical character. And then those could be areas where the city looks at implementing additional protections from encroachment of other development. So you could have more buffers requirements or transition areas, but it wouldn't affect, I don't think it would affect the actual zoning or what would be built on the property.
Elena, can I answer a question
Yeah.
more directly? So, historic overlay does not severely impact the use of the property. And I think that was where you were headed with the question, is that Shawnee District, from a historic perspective, not zoning, just looking at the historic perspective, it is a mixed-use area. And so historic overlay would want it to continue to be a mixed-use area. So historic in nature would say this should not all be single-family residential or all be commercial, because historically it was mixed use. Does that kind of answer your question there?
And so do we need to include a mixed use, or would that be in the zoning map? To Ann's point, you know, our old land use one has mixed use as a designation. So is that something that we need to be considering in this land use map, or is that more detail specific for zoning?
So the central city mixed use you see on here specifically, it covers that downtown core area, because the zoning ordinance actually allows a mix of uses within those buildings. I think what Ann's talking about is more when you have separate neighborhoods where maybe you want access to grocery stores or be able to walk to a bodega, or, you know, so to allow for a mix of land uses in close proximity to each other where neighborhoods have easy access to services. And so if that's not clearly reflected in these categories, most certainly the committee could recommend the consultant look at adding additional mixed-use category that would allow mix of residential and commercial in the same area.
Is there any, I mean, as far as the conservation aspect goes, or trying to preserve character of neighborhoods, any concerns about making sure we identify certain neighborhoods as kind of being, having some extra layer of protection under these maps from anybody on the committee?
We did that kind of with that exercise, I think it was like back in April, where we had the maps on the walls broken up into two groups.
Yeah.
That's a consideration. I know we took photos and.
Yeah, that's what the consultant used to create those neighborhood units that you saw in the housing survey, to try to create some distinction between one place and another for evaluation purposes. But yeah, that most certainly can be used for looking at applying some of these overlays or new categories.
What kind of category would that be, Ken?
You know, I would think if there's gonna be an overlay map possibly, that, you know, you might, like, for example, you might have a future land use plan that just shows the area, you know, north of College Street going toward, you know, like the old pecan orchard, and then Regay Street. It might show it all as mainly being single family, but there may be some distinct neighborhoods in there you want to preserve the character of, or say, hey, this the dominant or the type of construction in this area is smaller single family homes, and so maybe like adding another layer of if you're going to come in and do some development in that area, and this again is going to have to tie back into a zoning code at some point.
Yeah.
But if it's important to identify those areas and say, hey, this is something unique to the city, and we'd like to have some additional attention paid if somebody wants to come in and develop in that neighborhood, then that would be the kind of thought there to say, well, if you're going to develop, almost like we do in the historic overlay right now, you got to do something that's typically consistent with the character of the neighborhood, and is going to be meet some sort of city review process.
Yeah, so can maybe instead of conservation historic districts, maybe it's neighborhood conservation, where you're identifying certain neighborhoods that you want to protect, and then that could be implemented through, you know, new design standards for those areas.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. Any other comments on the land use designations? Anything on the industrial, public, or downtown, commercial? Those seem pretty much a carryover from the existing, but any comments on those?
So, Ken, I just wanted to point out, the commercial also has subcategories. Regional retail, neighborhood retail, and business employment. You know, just like we were talking about with residentials, breaking those out into separate categories. Does the group have any thoughts or feedback on keeping that all red, or actually breaking those out into separate colors?
So with the idea there being, like, maybe if you're in adjacent to the historic district downtown, something that we want to prioritize local businesses over, like, putting in a Subway restaurant or something like that? Would that be the idea?
So think about regional retail as your, like, kind of big box, like your big box Walmart and Lowe's and those larger kind of department stores that draw from the region, versus your neighborhood retail, which, you know, might be a little coffee shop or dry cleaner or daycare or something that's like that, is more, you know, low impact, it's more compatible with the neighborhood.
Okay. Yeah, I think, I mean, probably a lot of that, if it's a big box store, probably a lot of that's gonna be determined by traffic, just topography and traffic count and things like that, right?
Yeah.
But I guess if we're trying to prioritize, if we wanna say this is where we want this is where we want Target to be built or something like that, then is that the idea? Okay. Is there any thoughts on that, and trying to get more detail on designating different commercial areas?
This says this is a major artery, there's no road there.
Cindy, did you say you lived at Georgetown for a while?
It stops
When I visited there.
just after Pearl, it doesn't go across. This is Easter, this is, and that's Pearl.
It pushed all the
There's
big
nothing
boxes
between here and there.
traveled out to the 35 outside.
But it's a broken line.
I just think
Which is supposed to be
that, I feel like Ann's idea of
for the future, so I guess they're planning on going through
places for
there.
us to walk from
That would help.
So smaller places like that,
These are future.
pushing the bigger stuff. We are.
See, it goes, this is future.
Where's the land coming and then the traffic, I think that,
So here's Star, there's
we can have
Pearl.
a say in that.
So we'll go across and join.
Georgetown really limits, so nothing that is a chain or, like, pretty much just local businesses have to, like, there's about a, I don't know, few blocks spot off of 35 towards their downtown. And so it's kind of an issue sometimes, because sometimes they have sort of local chains that wanted to be in that area, so they had to be real specific about defining, you know, a chain. But it has really helped keep that area, it's a draw because it's all local businesses, local restaurants. But then they still have plenty of area for Targets and all the other things that we want to go to.
Question for you, Ed, because I know you work with these site selectors that come into town. Are they gonna look at something like this, like a future land use map, and go, no?
Probably not. Like, to give you an idea, there are 4 to 5 site selectors running around Nacogdoches right now, for anywhere from restaurant to regional chains to the whole litany of things. And every one of them is looking from Star Avenue to the North Loop and North Street. That's all they'll look at. And so, you know, I've tried to move them to University, I've tried to move them to the North Loop, I've tried to put them in different areas that, in my opinion, would accommodate them pretty well. I won't do it. So a lot of what we deal with is, you know, what they want. And, you know, either they don't come or, you know, we find them a spot. But, you know, the problem with where we are right now is, you know, as you well know, most of North Street's full. And to find an acre or two on North Street, so now we've got to go in and find properties that can be demolished and create new growth that way. And, you know, values have not risen enough to accommodate that. So they might look at this, but I don't think it's going to drive everything. I think they're going to still focus on that one area. But it's like anything else, we get one of them to go in a different area, then they're all gonna start going in a different area, so.
Why do you think they focus on that area? Is it traffic count?
Traffic count in the university. I mean, if I could pick an intersection in Nacogdoches that is the most desirable for out-of-town developers, it's Star North. That's where they all wanna be, right in there.
How do you think the interstate corridor might impact that?
Well, I mean, that's gonna be a whole different growth corridor. I mean, you're gonna have local industry or local businesses, and then you're gonna have those that cater to the traveler, because, you know, the interstate traveler, they're not gonna darken our door by and large. I mean, they're gonna keep going around, so that's gonna be a whole different growth corridor over there. It probably is not completely tied to Nacogdoches. So, anyway, but I mean, I don't know if it's the UT alignment or what it is, but in the last 3 or 4 months, I mean, we've seen quite an uptick of interest. So,
In line with what he was saying there, when you look at this planning map for the future, it shows that it looks as if you take the West Star from North Street to Pearl, and then on this map, it shows that there's a future road, main artery that would join with Old Tyler Road and then carry on out. Then would that help with some of the relief of the, are they really planning on doing that? Hopefully they will. It might help with the,
Yeah.
There's been some discussion, I don't know that it's gotten any traction yet, but it will, of what do we want Nacogdoches to look like with the future interstate? What's our gateway coming into Nacogdoches? Is it, where is it? Is it Old Tyler Road? Is it West Austin? I don't know right now, but we got to pick it. But at that point, we've got to really dress it up, and because I mean, if you go around the West Loop right now, which will be the interstate, you can't tell you're in Nacogdoches. You could be anywhere. And so we've got to change that viewpoint and how we want to look with that traffic coming by.
Do we know where the exits are going to be off of 69?
I don't think they've determined them yet. That's what I'm saying, because TxDOT, I'm sure they have an idea, but I mean, now's our time to talk to them and say, hey, as a community, this is what we would like. And I think they would listen.
Yeah, Ed, I'm sorry, you're absolutely right. So on this I-69 corridor plan, the group should identify where those key gateways are, where you would like to see those interchanges, because if we have a plan in place, then TxDOT will take that into consideration. But if we don't, then it doesn't give us as much teeth. So absolutely.
I would imagine in not too distant future, they're going to have a plan, and we're going to miss out.
Yeah. So you guys will see that I-69 corridor draft coming in the next month. They're working on it now, and it'll have kind of its own separate breakdown of land uses and key entry points, and you guys will have an opportunity to identify where those key gateway entries are.
Is there a local presence on that I-69 committee? By the time they do all draft plans, they've been doing a lot of thinking and a lot of planning. Seems that that's where we need to be right now.
Steve, Laura's gonna.
So there are regional committees that were formed to set kind of the alignment of I-69, which did a great job of keeping it on our existing footprint. We're proud of that. Right now, they are so focused, TxDOT, we have a regional TxDOT office that's based out of Lufkin, and city staff, and the city has an excellent, and the county has an excellent relationship with that TxDOT staff. Right now, they are so focused on upgrading existing interchanges that they're not looking at the locations of those exits yet. They're looking at upgrading the construction we all see at South Street, and the next they'll move up to 59 and 259. And that's in probably 2025, Steve, that they're gonna start running right away. So we're a couple years out from the exits, but when we get to that point, when they are planning those, the community will have a say in that, absolutely. There are interstate standards, though, that have to be met. So if we came back and said, we want 12 exits, they're gonna go, no, you get 5, and help us figure out where they should go. So there's probably some separation requirements that they would require us to keep, like a mile or whatever that is. But then we would help them identify what we see as the best exits to get into and out of the city.
Don't
You
you
threw
think-
out 5, is that something they've said?
Oh, no, sorry. Please don't. No, I just
Just
threw that
rolled
number.
that out.
Yeah, I just threw that number out.
Marissa, don't you think that's gonna be a pretty lengthy discussion though? I mean, it's not gonna be something we decide next week.
Right. I think it's a lengthy discussion. I also think it's something that we need to, that this plan will help dictate. So if we show, that we want a retail corridor here or an industrial corridor there, I think that will help TxDOT formulate a plan. They're not gonna walk into a room of a community meeting of Nacogdoches and say, where do you want your exits? And then make that happen. They're gonna come to us with a plan, and then we'll kind of negotiate which ones we think are appropriate.
Thank you. Thanks for elaborating.
Any other comments on the future land use designations? I did want to, at least briefly, what time we got? Got about 15 minutes. Talk about the housing study that was sent out. I don't know if you can bring that up.
So there is not a physical copy of the housing study in your packet, but we did give you guys physical copies a while back. We can have some printed real quick if people need them, but we didn't print those for this meeting.
No, that's fine. I just kind of wanted to talk about some of the conclusions of it. I just don't
Yeah.
know if I have a copy. I didn't print it out. It was 55 pages, so I didn't print it.
I do have a copy that I brought just in case. Well, I keep a copy in my binder, but I'll give that to you, Ken. And I can pull it up online as well.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we could just pull it up and we could look at just the conclusions. And Ed is our representative from the real estate side of the world, the one that's here. Just wanted to know if you had any thoughts about some of the conclusions in here regarding trends and where, because it sounds like there's a decided shift from owning to renting going on, at least a generational one. And I'm just curious to see what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I'm not sure, of course, Elena's got a couple of reports that I gave her that I think are gonna redefine a little bit. Now, just to give you an idea, it's about, if you look at, in the city limits, MLS sales last year was probably about 60% of the market. Non-city county was about 40% of the market. So my contention all along is that you've got neighborhoods just outside the city limits that are not being counted, even though they're really part of our community. And so I think that's going to change the look of things a little bit. I was shocked when they said the high percentage of rentals in town, and I don't necessarily agree with that. But with these new reports, I think it's going to define it a little bit better, and we can see it. But we're going to have to take in those neighborhoods, like, for example, Spring Creek. I mean, Spring Creek is 2 miles, 3 miles outside the city limits. I mean, it's basically a city subdivision, and almost none of them are rentals. You know, there are probably 200 units in there. And so, anyway, so yeah, I take a little bit of an issue with the report that I think it needs to be refined a little bit more. And, I mean, the basis of it, yeah, it's okay. But anyway, with this new data, I'm anxious to see what they do with it.
Is that data from MLS, like sales?
It is. It's an interesting report. It's actually comes from the National Association of Realtors, but it uses our data. And it breaks it down by price range, number of bedrooms, location. I mean, it's got great information in there, so. So, I mean, it doesn't list specific properties, but it defines it as much as it can, so. And that's readily accessible, so we could look at it once a year or once a month, you know. It's a canned report.
Okay. Yeah, you've got the recommendations up there. So, and I think, you know, we can go over the whole report, but I think the most important part, probably looking at the goals and recommendations. Let's see, what would be the easiest way to do that? Do you look at the goals? Or do you look at the recommendations?
Still trying to squint to read it.
Here you go. Let's talk about the goals, I think. So, the first goal listed is code compliance. Basically trying to get existing properties into compliance with the code, you know, mowing grass, cutting trees, getting junk vehicles out of yards, demolishing buildings that are unsafe. Any thoughts or comments on that goal? Any concerns with that as a goal?
No, I mean, I remember us covering that as a group early on.
Ken, what are we looking at?
This is the housing study.
And that was sent to us,
Here, let me,
Yeah,
I've got the email pulled up.
If you want.
it was sent by email?
Yes,
Yes.
yeah, the housing study was sent out a while back, and then we brought
Yeah.
physical copies to our meeting.
Print it. You had-
January 23rd.
We have physical copies?
Here.
I had one at one point, but I don't know where I got it. You know, I can text it to you.
Got it? Okay. Go text it. I think my computer.
Hey, Larry, get with me before you go, and we'll print you a copy. We had printed copies at one of our meetings, but you may have missed that one, so we'll print you one.
Yeah,
Home improvements in a program.
All right, let's move on to talk about the home improvement incentive program. Basically considering creating a program to incentivize homeowners to reinvest in their houses. One way to fund this program might be
Hey,
would be an
Remy, can you make it
advance
bigger?
of the net increase in city property tax revenue in the form of a grant. How would that work?
Ken, I think we actually need two of them.
Yeah.
We need one like the city council did for Jake Crawford to do a new development, new subdivision. And I thought the plan was great. But also, we've really encouraged these builders to do infill building. You know, that DTJ mentioned that there are 2,000 lots within the city limits that are not built on. And so I would love to see some type of incentive program for those builders that specifically do infill building. You know, like one of them is, building some, Harrison Burke Street. You know, they're gonna put over $1 million on our tax rolls of value. So, and there's been no incentive for that. So I'm wondering if that doesn't increase that work and that activity, if there's some kind of package for that. That's probably drilling down too far. but-
No, it isn't. I think it's kind of the same thing, like, because really, I mean, you're just talking about a level of a scope, right? Like building a house or renovating a house to make it. I know we already have a grant program for the historic properties. Now it's limited in funding, but kind of similar, where we try to incentivize people to. Could be as simple as replacing their lights outside, or it could be, anything that's gonna improve the aesthetics of the building. I think it's kind of interesting to say basically a grant of future increase in property tax. So if you're talking about building something, you're talking about going from an unimproved lot to something that might be a $6,000 property tax annually, and some sort of grant. They haven't fleshed that out at all.
No.
But are we talking about like a 3 or 5 year grant, maybe, like where you would almost like a tax abatement?
Tax abatement.
Yeah, it sounds like.
So the concept is that you look at the future revenue that would be created by that improvement
Mhm.
and give that in advance so they can use it to improve property. And there's different ways to do that.
Mhm.
That's a general concept.
And that does bring up more. I mean, if you take someone that takes a dilapidated house and fixes it up,
Mhm.
you know, in a neighborhood that's impacted, I mean, that's great. I mean, there were sections of Shreveport that I knew about that they would take these 1950s cottages that were not in good shape and completely renovate them, and the whole neighborhood looked wonderful at that point. So, and we've got a lot of old neighborhoods that sure use that.
But one of the issues I heard from builders is that the economics don't work on infill building on a single lot by lot. Would a ability to offer to a buyer some sort of tax abatement for a period of time, do you think that would allow them to make the economics work on those, or?
Either that or do the incentive to the builder, and then he could, hopefully the price comes down to where it's more affordable
Mhm.
for someone. I mean, I don't know, that may be impossible, but it would be a thought.
Yeah, where they basically get those property taxes for the next 5 years, something like that. That's interesting.
But the good part of it is, I mean, I don't know where these 2,000 lots are, but the good part is you can still economically buy a lot in the city limits. You know, they haven't gone through the roof, so you can pick up one for $10, $15, $20,000, where a new development, that lot's gonna be worth $50,000 or $60,000. So there is some savings just for the land.
Okay. Is that something that we'd all be interested in seeing more on? I know I would, but anybody else? As far as how an incentive program might work?
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
All right, so development connectivity, that's a weird way to phrase that. Explore mobility connections to allow the option of utilizing alternative modes of transportation, walking or biking, to access retail, commercial, office, downtown restaurants. Expand the network traveled by alternative transportation. Explore I-69 coordination to ensure that the neighborhood impacts are mitigated. I guess that it wouldn't prevent you from using alternate modes of transportation. Any thoughts on that? I know we talked about that when we were looking at goals, I think, as far as how accessible some of our neighborhoods are on bike or with sidewalks.
Yeah, Jaren brought that up.
I don't have any comments. Anybody else have a comment on that?
I mean, it's been brought up here and it's still a goal.
Yeah, I think we're still good there. Moving on to refinement of internal permitting processes, reviewing the existing city developmental regulations and internal processes to identify regulations and standards that can be modified to align with higher quality standards, explore the current staffing and process to identify any roadblocks, and obtaining entitlements and permits for new construction or other impediments to quality development. So that sounds like a two-pronged goal. Like, one, make sure the regulations and standards are of the level and encouraging the quality of development that we want, and then number two, making sure it's not too hard to get a permit.
Mhm.
Is that what it sounds like?
Yeah.
Any feedback on that? Sounds pretty reasonable to me.
I agree.
Any, is there a, I guess that's your section, isn't it, Steve? Permitting?
Yes, it's one of my divisions.
Is, do you get a lot of feedback from developers that things are too difficult?
Well, I'm not sure I would phrase it that way. So there are some that are, especially in our local area, that might feel some of our requirements are a little arduous. I will say, by and large, almost universally, anybody from outside academics, just comes from bigger communities, think that we're a very quick and easy and fast place. So we've worked to make a lot of improvements, Ken, to try to speed things up and to try to make that transition easier. And I think we've accomplished some of that. So hopefully, I think we've softened that a little bit.
Are there any, internally, have you talked to DTJ about any changes you might want to see in the permitting process or in regulations for new development?
I have not had that discussion with them. We do have some things underway, brand new software that we're implementing. Elaine and I are doing for not just inspections, but code enforcement and planning as well. So we're thinking some of those things may streamline and give us better customer service in as well. So I've been happy to share that with DTJ, but I have not had that discussion.
Okay.
Ken, there's a program, Elaine said they do, like, I think Briar College Station, where the city came up with a dozen or so plans for houses. You know, efficiency, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, and all a builder had to do was pick a plan, pick a lot, get it adjusted with the engineer, and build. And it was already everything was already approved by the city, and they like easier and cheaper.
Yeah, so what she's talking about is City of Bryan did an area plan for the area between kind of the downtown Bryan and Northgate, the kind of the university area, and basically identified different character types of the neighborhood, different types of housing that would blend in for infill, and then contracted with a consultant to create actual development plans so that, like you said, Ann, someone could just come in and say, hey, I want to build a single family or a duplex or this style, and then we just issue the plans because they've already been pre-approved essentially. So it takes out a lot of the soft costs that someone would have up front, hiring a designer and developing plans, and makes it easier because then they know there's less risk of submitting something that doesn't get approved, or submitting something and then having to change it, or something like that.
Was there any negative feedback on things kind of looking cookie cutter?
Yeah, so that was adopted after I left. They were ongoing, and then I moved back, but I haven't reached out to them recently to see how that was going. But we definitely can make a phone call and see, hey, has this been so successful? What's the feedback been? And bring that back to the group. But essentially, they were trying to make it as easy as possible for people to infill in that area.
Yeah.
Okay. And for it to be accepted by the neighborhood, right? Because the neighborhood had already had already signed off on the different designs too.
Yeah, I like that idea. And that kind of goes in with promoting existing developable tracts and really, I think, explore a jumpstart housing program. That kind of all ties into the what we've all been talking about on these goals, is trying to do infill development. Any comments on anything else on the housing study?
I don't know how this works. And it probably comes down to planning and zoning, is how do we decide, or if we can encourage or have
Yeah, that's Steve's area too. There's a southern building code that the city adopts that the houses have to be built to a certain standard or they don't get approved. And there are inspectors of the city that go check it. And they check plumbing, electrical, construction, that sort of thing. But, you know, as far as the style of construction, that's not regulated in any way. But the quality of the construction is.
About, is style something that, other cities, do they require that kind of thing? Especially in sensitive areas?
Yeah. I mean,
And it's one of their recommendations.
I have limited, you know, access to outside of this area, but it almost, to me, that's more geared toward the developer. You know, what does the developer want that community to look at? Like South Lake, you know, in the Dallas area. They did a whole community designed around what they wanted it to look like, but it wasn't the city that did that. It was private development. And so.
Well, and if you don't mind, Ed, I can speak to that. So in College Station, where I worked, they did have a set of design standards that dictated building materials and architecture. So like massing, height, roof line, architectural elements that broke up the building facades. It wasn't just a big blank wall. Now in 2019, the state legislature passed a bill that said cities can't regulate building materials anymore unless they're in a historic district. But that doesn't mean that we couldn't adopt design standards that spoke to like the architecture or like massing, not the building materials. So think about in single family, you know, requiring front porches and dormers and things that speak to the kind of physical character of the home. Or in commercial, you know, think about, you know, how the front facade looks and things like that. So to answer your question, a lot of cities do adopt regulations that dictate the design of a building that don't include building materials itself. So,
for example, in Overland Park, Kansas, you can't have a commercial building that is painted white. So when White Castle came into Overland Park, Kansas, they had to paint their buildings. They had to paint their building off-white, according to the standards of the.
One of the recommendations in it was developing a pattern book with pre-approved designs and things to maintain neighborhood integrity, which kind of seems like what you're getting at. Like these are the style of houses that, not specifically how you're building it, but it needs to look like this.
Well, I mean, they want it to last.
Or the fact that they're building
But
it.
also look like it's sort of sticking out.
yeah, so if you had an existing neighborhood and all the houses had a two-car garage, we could dictate that all new houses have a two-car garage. Or if all the houses had a front porch, you could dictate all new houses have a front porch so that new construction blends in with existing and doesn't have a stark contrast, if that makes sense.
In Nacogdoches, though, most of that's done through HOA rules, deed restrictions that's imposed by the developer. And then the residents, you know, monitor that and have
You're talking about
committees.
infill, so if we're talking about infill, that's.
Well, or new development too. I mean, either one, but it, the thing that, you know, maybe I'm going too far, but the thing you have to be most careful about is if you impose too many restrictions on the builder, whether it be commercial or residential, and the cost to build it goes up exponentially, they just won't build. And so it's almost like you stymie new growth, by putting too many regulations on them. So, I mean, I'm with you 100% on the quality of the home. I mean, I'm glad we've got building standards that, you know, is enforced. But you know, if we had a, you know, requirement in the city that all our new streets had to be brick, you know, that would kill it.
Yeah.
And then there probably wouldn't be any new development, so.
Yeah. And so Denise, a lot of the cities that have those are specific to certain neighborhoods or are specific to certain districts. They're not citywide requirements.
That's what I was thinking, like, our historical neighborhoods might be, you know, we could have some criteria there. And, I mean, I don't know if we could really increase the cost a lot, and then especially if we're talking about doing some kind of incentive,
Right.
maybe that would bring the cost down.
And if you got something you wanted to preserve, like downtown, absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
that, you know, you want to preserve that. You want to make sure that quality's there and it looks like it does.
Well, I just see Gardner Street, and I know it's there next to the college, so it's gonna have a lot of, you know, apartments, and it had been a pretty nice little street, and now it's kind of not. So I just feel like we just said,
that's on the border.
I wish we could do something about that. We
Yeah,
haven't had that.
that's where there's some like mobile home type buildings.
Mhm.
There. Yeah. I'm familiar with that.
So,
And,
Denise, that might be a good area for a neighborhood conservation or transition area or something like that.
This might be very unpopular, but, you know, I think some standards for commercial buildings would be very appropriate so that we don't have corrugated metal buildings, going up on North Street that are listed and that sort of thing. I mean, it's just my personal thought. And everybody may disagree with me.
I have heard, different, small business owners who have not been pleased with the bright colored paint on certain areas, you know, that have come into town, like the liquor store or something, you know, that didn't quite fit into the historical, what you would think of when you're coming into a historical place. But one thing I wanted to say, so many of these things really are good, and I'm sure there will be many things that we will have missed that maybe we should have put in. But I'm reading, I had to give a report for the Federation of Women of the things that we were doing here. And one of the things that it said in one of the first articles that was in the paper a year or so ago when it was decided that there would be an overall plan, you know, is that just because it's in the plan doesn't mean that it would be implemented, but that would be up to the city council to decide what would be implemented or what wouldn't be implemented. And that if the citizenry is concerned about it, then it's our responsibility to gather people together and see that it's done. That was in an article, with people already know, you know, it was in that first article. So, it's wonderful if we can get some of these things in that we want, but it doesn't mean that the city council will decide to implement any of it. You know, so if there are really issues that we want done, then we'll be responsible to visit from time to time, not just in the meeting, but a lot of times you can get more done if you meet with the councilman not during the meeting, so that they're not, you know, blindsided and, you know, just that you don't want to be there just to embarrass people. If you're really interested in doing something, you want to work together to see if you can come up with something that would prevent some of the things that you were concerned about. Or, yeah, so that's what I have to say.
What does it hurt to have it in there? I mean, you never want to get done, but it's there. I'm sorry, maybe what does it hurt to have it in there if it may or may not be implemented? I'm asking, because I don't really know. Is there a reason that we wouldn't want it in there if we all think it's a good idea?
I think it comes down to, you know, is it a goal? If you're looking at, is infill development or incentivizing development within the city important or not? And if it's important, if we agree it's important, it should probably be in the plan. Whether or not it happens is another thing. But I think we're looking at aspirational, hey, this is something we should try to incentivize over the next 15, 20 years. Now, how do we do it? I don't know.
The issue of infill development, I think, when we started this whole process, is one of the controversial things. But I think it's infill development that matches the character of the existing neighborhood. I think everybody could be happy with that.
And it's not that hard to do. When we built my office, we're technically not in the historic overlay area, but we're like right in the middle of all of it, weirdly. And it was just important to me that we didn't look like some random building that didn't fit with everything. And it wasn't that hard for us to just shift kind of the design of it so it sort of fit things. It's not that difficult necessarily to do, especially if you're not really designating building materials and some of those things. So I think there's a way to do both, where as somebody who, you know, my husband does development stuff, it would be nice to be able to use some of these lots that are vacant and, you know, need to have houses on them without having too many restrictions on it. But I also think there's a way to make them fit the neighborhood without it being too restrictive.
construction, except for construction standards needed for state or federal funding or housing programs, materials necessary for wind, storm, and hail insurance, and then buildings in designated historical and cultural areas. So, for example, on North Street, due to the state law of North Street, unless North Street is in a designated historic or cultural district, the city can't say you can't use corrugated metal on the outside of the building.
It could always become one.
It could, exactly.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Last time, I called it, time talking about how communities are being eroded by student population, going into residential neighborhoods, and you'll have 7, 8 students living in a residential home. Did that work back into our plan or discussion or anything this time?
For, in what way, about as far as, the concentration of rentals and,
Minimize that from happening.
yeah,
Would that be the code compliance?
yeah.
That.
Yeah, so in the, updated goal matrix that you guys have, kind of like that Excel sheet, it's got a recommendation in there for exploring programs to monitor the concentration of rental property in neighborhoods. So that's one of the, recommendations in your goal, or your guiding principles matrix.
I didn't see that.
So, as I mentioned, I know we're after 5 o'clock, so I'd like to wrap it up. Any comments on the draft, plan or those revised draft goals, which they're all gonna be kind of together there? Please put those in writing. And how do we wanna do that, Elena? Do you want everybody to email you and then you can compile those?
Yeah, if everyone will just email me, I'll create a folder and just drop everything in there, and then I'll consolidate it, and we'll create an agenda out of those.
Okay, that'll work. And then future meetings, thank you for bringing that up. I wasn't sure when our next meeting was. So we've got March 16th and April 12th are the only two on the calendar right now?
Yes, so those are the next 2 months. Essentially, we still meet the second Thursday of every month, and so I just wanted to make sure everyone knew, hey, the next couple of months we'll be meeting here. The March meeting is different because of spring break. We moved that, if everyone will remember, but going forward, it'll always be the second Thursday unless something comes up. So, yeah, March 16th and April 12th, we'll meet right here in this room at 3:30.
All right, I don't think we have anything else for today, so we're adjourned.